Hello and welcome to Learn Python 3 the Hard Way, exercise 32, where we finally get into looping. Now, in exercise 23 and a few others, he did a teeny bit of looping in a different way, kind of a different way from what Python normally uses. In this exercise, we're going to use for loops, but to do for loops, you got to learn lists. So, I have the code here, but first I'm going to play around in the Python shell. So what I've got, let me just type Python. Okay. So a list is something you already did when you did the argv. Do you remember from sys import argv, right? Those were lists. So now we're going to learn about, a bit about how lists actually are formed, what they do, and why you use them. Okay. So I'm going to just say X. I'm just going to use really simple. I'm going to do 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. So this is a list of numbers, okay? And with a list of numbers, I can do certain things to them, okay? I can do things like I can get the first one. Weird, right? Exercise X0. I can use this kind of bracket, see this square bracket and square bracket, and then I can use an index, and that gives me 5. If I do index 1, that gives me 6. And I do index 2, that gives me 7. And I do index 3, it gives me 8. It's very weird, right? You would think index 1 would give me the 5 from up there. So let me do a different list. Let me do something very arbitrary, right? So that way we're not dealing with numbers. Let's do let's do A, B, C, and D. Okay, now thinking with the example above, if I type Y0, which one is that going to give me? Right, it's going to give me A. Okay, now if I do Y2, which one is that going to give me? Is it going to give me B or C? And I'm going to give you a reason why this is, and we get more into this later on. But for the most part, all of the lists in a lot of programming languages use an index. So an index is sort of like a count of where something is, or a point of access. They use an index that starts at 0 for specific reasons, because if you have an index that starts at 0 rather than 1, you can do certain math that makes it easier to access elements of the list. So we all just sort of like agreed 0 is a good one. Not every language does this. I know Lua and a few other languages start at 1. And those languages, the math doesn't quite work with them in certain situations, but it's a little easier for people to work with because we are used to starting things at 1. The way to understand this is if you think it should start at 1, what you're saying is give me the first one, the second one, the third one. Okay? Now that would make sense if I couldn't just jump to Y3, right? This is a random access. So first, second, third, fourth implies, or it says, I have to go through the first one to get, the first through fourth to get to the fifth one, right? Think of a horse race. I have to have a first horse to have a second horse to have a third horse and so on. So that's in order. If I have a year, I can't have year 2016 without having a year 1 and a year 1920 and a year 1985, right? I have to go through those numbers. But this is random access. It's if this were years, this is time travel. I can jump around anywhere I want. So because I can jump around wherever I want, there's no such thing as a first element. There's no 0th element, right? Okay. So what that means is because it's random access, I'm going to start at 0. It's just, for now, just say that's the way it is. How do you deal with this? Well, anytime you're going to go and you say, I want the first, anytime you do second, anytime you do those, right, what we call ordinal or in order numbers, subtract 1. So if I want the third one, which is C, I'm going to say -1, that's 2. If I want the fourth one, that's D, then I'm going to do -1, that's 3. Now what happens if I go past the end of this list? Okay, well, let's do Y100. You get this kind of error, list index out of range. Okay, so you have a limit, right? Here's where, this is going to be maybe a brain teaser for you. Here's where the 0 comes in handy. I can take any number. Let's say I'm going to do X, and I'm going to do I equals that. I can take any number I want, and I can do Y, I, and we have the modulus operator, and I can do the length of y, and I'm guaranteed that this I will always be inside this list. Okay? Think about that for a bit. That would be a good thing to kind of take apart and understand why that is. And this is why we have 0. This is one of the bigger reasons. There's a lot of other math that just works better, but this is one of the big reasons why we have 0-based indexing. Okay? Other than that, there's nothing fancy about lists. They're very simple. It's like a deck of cards or a shopping list, a to-do list. Everybody in the entire universe uses lists. Okay, it's one column in a spreadsheet. Okay, so now we have for loops. This is our first loop. And the thing about a for loop that's nice is it will loop over. It will go through a list and stop reliably. Okay, while loops don't do that, and that's another type of loop we're going to run into. That's why we don't use while loops too much. We try to use for loops. For loops are guaranteed to end. While loops are not guaranteed to end. Okay, so with a for loop, I can do for j in y, print j. Okay, a little shorthand code there, and what it does is ignore the dots, and it goes A, B, C, D. When you look at what's in Y, A, B, C, D. Now, how do you read this? So I'm saying for each element in Y, call it J and do, right? That's one way to read a for loop. Is for every element in Y, I want you to make me a variable called J, okay? One variable, and then do this stuff. And inside that, we get J to work with. All right, so now let's go look at our code over here. And yeah, let me full screen these and increase the font so you can read it. Okay, so the code for 32. First thing I do is I set up some lists. Now you'll notice some key ingredients here. Line 3. So I made a list with numbers in it, and I made a list with strings in it. But this list is a list of numbers and strings. The nice thing about Python's lists is you can put anything in them. I believe anything. I think there's maybe something. No, I believe it's anything. Yeah. So you can put anything inside lists. You can even put, remember, we have a sort of a rule in programming. I can put things inside things. I can work things with things. I can put lists inside lists. So think about that. Now, we have our 3 lists. That should be straightforward. You just format them with a brace here, and there's the other brace at the end, and then you write each element and you use a comma to separate the elements. It's pretty easy. It's a lot like your function calls and your function parameters. Okay, then I have my for loop, right? So for each number in the count. So if you look up, the count is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's up at line 1. So that means within this code block, I have a variable named number. Number is assigned to each element of the count. So if you're going to go through and translate this code to English, that's how you would do it. It might be a very good thing to do. So now I have the variable number. Remember, this is an F string. See the F string? So that F string means I can access this number. And if you look, that number's there, and then it's used here. Okay? So that's all a for loop does, is it takes each, for each is the way to think about it. For each element of this. So for each number in the count. Okay? And that's not a very common phrase. In fact, I've probably only read that phrase in old books from the 1890s. So I don't think it's like a common English phrase this much these days. But in programming, it's very common. So you'll say for each number in the count. Okay, now let's look at the next one, fruits. For each fruit in fruits. And then I have the same thing down here. So if I write the English for that, it's variable fruits, or I could say named fruit is assigned each element of fruits. Now, reading this, I actually have an error up here. This is technically incorrect. Number is not assigned to each one. So it's not like number is placed inside here. It's the reverse. Number is assigned the value of each element is another way to do it. Okay? Okay, now I have change. So change is, nickels and dimes and quarters, okay? And it's the same deal, except I have I. So this is kind of common. I tend to tell people to stay away from single letter variables, right? Even though you saw me doing it over here. It's common shorthand to use I and J. So I is in your first level loops, J would be in your second level loops. And then, after that, maybe it gets more complicated. Try to use a descriptive name like I did with fruit and fruits, but I is fine. And then this is the same thing. Now, here's where we get to a new thing with lists, all right? So I create an empty list. This is how you create an empty list, okay? Incidentally, if you ever wanted to copy a list, okay, I can do this. No, actually, let me demonstrate that really quick in here. Okay, so let's say I have Y, and I want to make a copy of the contents of Y, okay? I want to call it howdy. Well, there's no like dot copy, even though there should be. Instead, you do this, okay? And it seems weird, but Python has this ability to select ranges. So I can say Y 1 through 2, and that's going to be B. But if I do 1 through 3, it's going to be C. And if I do 1 through 4, it's going to be D. So it includes everything but the final number. So it goes up from 1 to 3. So the way you say I want everything in a list is you do, and if I leave off one side, if I leave off that side, it's going to be everything up to 4, everything up to 2, and so on, right? So if I leave off this side, it's everything from 1 on, everything from 2 on, everything from 3 on, right? So if I leave both sides off, it's basically a copy. And each time I was doing these, it's making a new list, just so you know. Okay, so if that's the case, then to copy a list, you do that. All right, now back to what we were doing. Up here, though, we're making an empty list, okay? So we're going to make this empty list. We're going to go through this function called range. So range, the job of range is to make, basically make a list that goes from numbers to numbers, right? So if I go range, and what you're getting in the output is not a full. So actually, if I do this, range 0, 100, I think that'll give me what I want. Yeah. So range on its own is just a counter. It's just going to figure out how to count all these numbers. I do list around that, and I get a list with each of those numbers in it. So you can use range to go through a fixed set of numbers. Okay, so you can start at 0, 100, -5. There's ways to go up by 2s. I believe, like, let's say I can go from 1000 to 100 by -2. I think that'll work. Yep. See, that goes down by 2 until you get to 100. So there's a lot of crazy stuff you can do. In this case, we're going to go from 0 to 6. We're going to print out a message, right? And then we're going to call this function append. So if you remember, there's ways to call functions on things. So if I have howdy \n, right? So let me print that so you can see. Right? I don't want that extra space, so I can do .strip to take it out. So remember that. So I can do the same thing with lists. Lists have their own set of functions I can call on them too. I do a dot, that tells the list to do a thing, and in this case I'm saying append I to this. So then when I get out of this for loop, elements is full of numbers ranging from 0 to, I believe, 5. I believe it doesn't include the 6. So for I and elements, print I was that, then prints them all out. Okay, so that's a review of that, and there's 4 different for loops. Let me quit out of the shell. We're going to do ex32.py. All right, so we see the fruit get printed, apples, oranges, pears, the count is printed, the things, I'm adding 0 through 1 to the list, and elements are 0 through 1. Let me side by side the code. There we go. And drop this down. Okay, so if I side by side the code, you can sort of see, look up at the top, this is count 1. So here's the message for this is count 1 on line 8 here, right? And this is the count, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the same thing with fruits. A fruit of type this, fruit, apples, oranges, pears, apricots. And then so on and so forth. And then range 0 through 6, I was right, it only goes up to 5. It doesn't include the 6. And then it prints each one out. Okay, so debugging. The concept of for loops should be pretty straightforward. I find for loops are way easier to understand for people than while loops. The thing that trips people up with for loops is the creation of this variable. They consider it magic if that variable just shows up. They expect, the mistake folks think is they think they have to do something like that. They have to set a variable. So all a for loop is doing is doing that equals for you and then running your code with that equals. Okay, if I were to debug this, one place I could see debugging would be right here. If I didn't get the right number of elements, I might do something like this. Okay, because then once I do that, I can sort of figure out what might be going wrong. Like if I expected to get 6 elements, okay, and I was only getting 5. The problem is the error could be how I wrote this. I can look at it and know, but you might not be able to. Maybe I did this, maybe I did this wrong. Something's wrong. Now the error, if I only get 5 instead of 6, is that range doesn't go up to 6. It's non-inclusive, we call it. So by printing that out, I can see what kind of list I have. Okay. Other places you can break this. Let me see. See what happens when the lists are empty. See what happens when you put various things inside the list. One advantage of for loops is they're super hard to break. So yeah, it's that's one of the reasons why people use them. It's just hard to break a for loop. If it's a list and it's got stuff in it, you'll print it. If it doesn't have stuff in it, you'll skip it. What's another thing? Oh, I have no idea why it did that. We can do something else. Let's try something. So that for loop was making I, right? It's making that variable. After range, I equals, and let's do I. Okay, so here's the question. Based on what you think, what should happen? After that for loop runs, is that I only available inside the for loop? Is it something that's private to that for loop? Or is it something that you get access to after? So let's give this a shot. Basically, should I get an error or should it print something out? And after, I is set to 5. So Python's making these variables, and then at the end, it's giving you the final result. That's something to understand because in other languages, they wouldn't do that. In other languages, the variable goes away. There's significance to this. That means maybe you can't use that variable for what you thought it was. Maybe you'll try to use it and you'll get a mistake. So like maybe don't use variables once they've been inside a for loop. That might be something to consider. Maybe that's something you want to do. Okay, that's the end of exercise 32. See you at the next one.